now. There we go. Okay, so thank you everyone for coming. We have an incredibly special guest today. Our presenter is going to be Bob Ferguson, who is, as you probably know, the state attorney general. He's going to be telling us about some of the really amazing cases they've been working on. And I will just remind you that we will be taking questions in the chat. So if something comes up and you want to know about it, ask those. And at the end, we will try and get in as many of them as we possibly can. So with that, I will hand it over.
Well, thanks so much, Helen. It's great to see you all. Hope you're all doing well. And thanks to the League of Women Voters and to the Foley Institute for sort of combining on this event. I just really, I really appreciate it. And it's great to get a chance to talk about the AG's office and things we're working on, and then really answer any questions you might have. So what I'm going to try and do, Helen, is I'm going to aim for speaking till no later than 7:15, and then just leaving the rest of the time for whatever questions that you have. And really feel free to ask about the issues I bring up or anything else that's on your mind, and I'll do my best to answer them. As you can imagine, once in a while I get a question that I can't answer because, of course, part of our job is giving legal advice to the state of Washington, to the governor, to the legislature, to our clients. And so sometimes I get a question that goes to that advice, which ethically, as a lawyer, I can't give any more than your lawyers can't share the advice they give to you about a matter with the public. So, but those questions are pretty rare. So for the most part, I'm able to answer pretty much whatever might be on your mind. And today I'm going to focus on, I think, two issues that I was kind of asked to focus on. And I'll address each of those at a somewhat high level, just given the time. One of those issues is work we're doing, that we've been doing, but work that's sort of coming to a head now related to the opioid epidemic and to litigation we have against Purdue Pharmaceutical. In fact, we were in federal court just yesterday, arguing a key motion in that case. And the Purdue Pharmaceutical is owned by the Sackler family, who you've no doubt read about recently. So that's one case. And the other case we have is a trial that's actually going on as we speak. We've been in court the past few weeks against three very large Fortune 15 companies, distributors of opioids. So those are companies like Cardinal Health, AmerisourceBergen. These are our large corporations, and we've alleged they've acted unlawfully and fueled the opioid epidemic. And that's literally a case that's in trial right now. We're the first state to take those entities to trial, and I'll talk a bit about those cases, in addition to a really big issue related, something that you see referred to as MMIWP. It's an acronym for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and People, MMIWP. And I was asked to say a few words about some work we're doing with community members, with tribes, with stakeholders on that really important issue as well. So I'll take a minute just to describe kind of what the AG's office is, who we are and what we do. I'll again keep this at a very high level, but think of us as the largest law firm in the state of Washington, which we are. We have more than 1,500 employees. So we're a large operation. We have more than 650 attorneys, a similar size support staff, professional staff. So it's a big operation. We have 13 offices around the state. So I live closest. I live in North Seattle. That's where I'm zooming in from, in my basement. And so I live and work primarily out of our Seattle office, though I'm often in our Olympia office as well, pre-COVID, post-COVID time, as you might imagine. But we also have offices all around the state, including Pullman, Washington, for example. And so think of the work that we do kind of in two buckets, oversimplifying a little bit, but think of it in two buckets. The biggest bucket, the most resources, the most people, the work we do is being the law firm for the state of Washington. And by the state of Washington, that might intuitively be to you, the governor, the state legislature, statewide elected officials. Those are all of our clients, to be sure. But we are also law firm for every single state board, commission, and agency, of which there are a couple hundred. Some are big, and you would know them well. Department of Corrections, that's a big, complex client, right? Others are so small you probably never heard of them, and there may only be a few people involved in those with those agencies. But we're their law firm. We give them legal advice. Importantly, those clients make the decisions about what they want to do. We don't tell the head of corrections or the head of ecology how to run their divisions. They make those policy decisions. We give them legal advice when they ask for it. We give them their legal options. And so that's a big part of what we do, of course. The other part of our job, which is smaller, although still significant, but if you read about our office, this is where you would read about our office in the newspaper or hear about us in the news. And that's the work we do directly on behalf of the people of the state of Washington. And this will be the issues I talk about here tonight. So those tend to be divisions like consumer protection, what we call complex litigation. Much of our litigation at the federal level, for example, comes through our complex litigation team, also our civil rights team, antitrust, environmental enforcement. All of those divisions are what we call affirmative litigation divisions. The client in those cases are you, the people of the state of Washington. So the decisions on whether or not, for example, to go to trial or file a lawsuit against these three distributors for fueling the opioid epidemic, that's not the governor's decision. That's not the head of some agency. That's my decision. Whether we settle the case, whether we go to trial, whether we, how we handle our case, those are all decisions that I make as Attorney General. And I can assure you I have multiple conversations every day about any number of those cases that are going on, as I did today. And so that work is different in very significant ways. And so I'm able more to speak about those cases because there's not a client, so to speak, like the governor that I need to keep a confidentiality agreement in place with. So the work is important, as you might imagine, and very consequential for the people of the state of Washington, as evidenced by these two issues I'm going to talk about. So I'll start maybe with the opioid epidemic. And again, happy to take more detailed questions because I'll be talking about very complex cases on a, unfortunately, relatively superficial level. But right now we have multiple cases going on, but we have two key ones that are happening right now. One is against Purdue Pharmaceutical, owned by the Sackler family. They're the creators of OxyContin. You've no doubt read about them if you're following the opioid epidemic in the news, that they're getting a lot of national headlines. What happened is there was virtually all the state AGs in the country, Republicans and Democrats, had sort of joined forces in what we call a multi-state investigation against them. And some states like Washington filed lawsuits, for example, against Purdue. Not every state, but many states like Washington. We were litigating our case and really on the verge of going to trial when Purdue, not the Sackler family, when Purdue Pharmaceutical declared bankruptcy. This was after a number of years when the Sackler family, it's a closely held corporation. Sacklers serve on the board of directors, for example, make decisions about the company. The Sacklers had been pulling out billions, that's with a B, billions of dollars from Purdue Pharmaceutical and stashing those billions of dollars in overseas accounts because litigation was coming and they were trying to protect their assets. Then Purdue filed for bankruptcy. Well, what happened then is they filed before a very specific bankruptcy judge in New York who has a history of approving a very specific type of bankruptcy arrangement. And that is the Sackler family, who is not going through bankruptcy. They're billionaires. They're one of the wealthiest families in the country. They offered to put in a few $1 billion into the settlement, right? To resolve the bankruptcy with Purdue, they would put in a few $1 billion of their money, of their many billions of dollars, under one very important condition, that they have a legal shield for life from any lawsuit brought by any individual or any state attorney general or anyone else. So again, the family's not going through bankruptcy. They're billionaires many times over, and they're gonna be billionaires and this is all over. But they said, we'll put in a few billion if, bankruptcy judge, you give us a legal shield for life, and the judge approved that. We don't think the judge had that authority to do that, okay? For obvious reasons, right? There can't be two forms of justice. Justice for everybody on this call, right? And Sackler justice if you just happen to be billionaires and you can afford to put in a few billion and then walk away and never face any accountability for your actions from any pesky attorney general out in the state of Washington or anywhere else. So we have appealed that decision from that bankruptcy judge, okay? And we're really leading the coalition of states. There's about 10 states opposing it. And so Noah Purcell, my Solicitor General, was back in New York just yesterday, if I have my days correct, if my days right. He was in New York yesterday arguing before a federal district court judge to essentially strike down that bankruptcy deal. Many states agreed to that bankruptcy deal, right? And they're getting some money out of that if the deal's allowed to go forward. From my standpoint, I rejected that deal and think that the Sacklers should be held accountable for their role in fueling the opioid epidemic. So that's the Purdue case. The other case is this case against these three distributors that I mentioned earlier, and that case has gone to trial. So we're literally in trial right now in King County Superior Court, just downtown Seattle. Trial started 2 weeks ago. We expect the trial to last for 3 months. The case in a nutshell, again, big case, but trying to distill it down, is that these distributors violated the law when they distributed opioids. And to give you an example, distributors have legal obligations before they can distribute opioids, which are highly, highly addictive, as you know. And for example, if they see suspicious orders from a community, they have a legal obligation not to ship that order of opioids and to notify the authorities about the suspicious order. Well, in Washington state, there were more than a dozen counties in our state where these distributors distributed more opioid prescriptions, not pills, more prescriptions than there are people in more than a dozen counties in Washington state. These counties are Eastern Washington, Western Washington, blue, red, rural, urban. The epidemic is indiscriminate when it comes to those kinds of issues. But I don't think you need to have a PhD in investigating opioid orders to sense that if a community has more opioid prescriptions than there are people, maybe you've got some suspicious orders there. Maybe that's not actual physical pain that people are suffering. Maybe that's addiction that people are trying to get those pills for. And it's our contention these companies failed in their legal obligations, which are significant, before shipping those opioids. So that trial is going on now. There is a settlement that most states agreed to, most AGs agreed to. I did not agree to it, in part because we've been litigating our case. Unlike some states never filed a case against them, some file but aren't actually litigating the case, which is hard. We've done that. We've survived all the motions to dismiss. We've gone through all the discovery. And so we think that, I think that having accountability for these companies is important, and that it is my hope that we do better at trial financially, and we get accountability for the company for the harm that they cause to Washingtonians. I'm happy to chat more about that decision, which is obviously a complicated one, if you have questions about that and the factors that go into it. Moving very quickly on to the MMIWP issue. I'm glad that you all were kind of curious about that. This issue has thankfully gotten more media attention in the past couple of years. There have been tribal members, community activists, grassroots activists who have been trying to draw attention to the real crisis we face, not just here in Washington, but really across the country, with missing and murdered Indigenous women and people. It is of epidemic proportions. In Washington state, importantly, we have 29 federally recognized tribes. We have, of course, a large number of tribal members. Tribes play a key role in our economy, in our way of life, our history, obviously, and putting it mildly. And this crisis we have with missing and murdered Indigenous women and people is just heartbreaking in the extreme. And so the state legislature in the last legislative session decided to create a task force to try and come up with recommendations to address this issue. The AG's office is leading that task force. The first day of the task force meeting was today. Today's first meeting was devoted to public comment, entirely to public comment. And tomorrow morning, then the meetings then kick off post public comment to start discussing what are potential recommendations that this task force can make to the state legislature. So again, this is a task force that'll make recommendations. A lot's been written about this issue. I guess what I will say is that there will need to be more resources undoubtedly put forward by the state legislature to address this crisis. Number two, law enforcement agencies across the state, big, small, rural, urban, wherever they are, we all need to be better coordinated on sharing information about these issues. When it comes to issues related to missing and murdered Indigenous women, there's no border that it respects, right? These cross state lines, county lines, city lines, and law enforcement agencies do not always sort of speak to each other, use the same computer systems, you name it, right? There are all sorts of challenges around that. And so even at the most basic level of getting accurate data around the scale of the crisis has been a significant challenge. And so, it can be difficult to address a challenge where you don't have your arms around the scope of the challenge and the scope of the crisis. But that is something the task force will undoubtedly be addressing as we try to come up with ultimately, essentially a statewide response to this crisis. I want to be clear, look, the task force has a role here, but we're just trying to build on the work of tribal members, tribes, community members, activists who've been on this issue for a long, long time, right? I'm not suggesting that the AG's office by any stretch of the imagination has the answers here, not at all. We're one small part of a large effort to try and address this issue. I did want to say, if you want more information on that, I do want to just give our website. The AG's website has more information. That's ATG, like Apple, Tom, Go, Attorney General, atg.wa.gov. And there you can find the information also of Annie Forsman, who's the coordinator. She's an employee in my office, and she's the coordinator of this task force, Annie Forsman. And her contact information, I'm sure, is there as well if you want more information about the task force. So it's now 7:16. I almost made Helen my 7:15 promise of wrapping up my initial comments. And I'll just turn it over to you, Helen, to, I guess, read off whatever questions that folks have. And again, I'll do my best to answer them.
Awesome. Since we were just talking about it, I'm going to go through the MMIWP questions first, and then we'll go backwards from there.
Great.
So let's see. One question is, are there also issues stemming from the failure to acknowledge tribal sovereignty? Yes.
Yeah, man, I think, look, I don't want to speak with too broad a brush, number one, right? But from the state's perspective, there's no sort of question about tribal sovereignty, right? Tribes are sovereign nations, full stop. I don't want to suggest that, hey, everybody in the state is at the same level of awareness of that, right? But when it comes to issues of missing and murdered Indigenous women, I guess I'm not sure that I would put sort of that issue sort of at the top list of what the obstruction is to solving the issue. Okay, I think a lack of awareness of tribal issues, maybe way up there, right? Appreciation for those issues, focusing resources on those issues, right? Making it a priority, focus on those resources. Yes, and yes. Okay, but I'm not sure that sort of a lack of appreciation of tribal sovereignty is necessarily a driver on this, right? But it is. I'm glad that whoever asked the question or made that comment brought up, because tribal sovereignty is not really fully appreciated or understood in our state or really across the country, even amongst my fellow AGs across the country who often come from states with very few tribes, unlike Washington State. But look, a big part of my work is working with tribes and respecting that tribal sovereignty. It's nation-to-nation conversations, right? They are separate governments entirely, is something that's very fundamental to how we approach in the AG's office and how the state approaches working with tribes as well.
Awesome, thank you. So our next question is, okay, this is a little bit procedural, I guess. Does Washington State and the tribes have the authority to investigate and or bring charges against perpetrators who are non-tribal members but commit a crime on tribal lands?
Yeah, so the state, that is procedural. It gets complicated fast, but what I can say is that the task force does not have any authority, right? The task force is a task force, right? It doesn't have any jurisdiction to do anything beyond making the recommendations. I can also say, well, that's sort of a tricky question at the local level. For the state level, it's straightforward, because I know this may seem strange, but even though I'm the Attorney General for the state of Washington, I actually don't have basically any criminal authority at all. So if someone, I hope this doesn't happen, but if someone broke into your car tonight, right, I would not have any authority to investigate that or to do anything about it. I don't have that authority, which I know sounds a little bit strange as the Attorney General, but criminal authority rests with local law enforcement, right? Your county prosecutors primarily, for the county prosecutors, although city attorneys also have authority, for example, around misdemeanors. But no, the state has no authority, no criminal authority over those issues. Now that's what I can say. Maybe I should add just one thing, if that's okay, is that I do have a criminal division. It's small in the AG's office. So if a county prosecutor asks us to take a case, we can take it. Okay, so sometimes they do that when they have a conflict. They can't bring in the case because maybe a key witness is a county employee, or they lack the resources to take on a very complex murder, and they're a small county with only a handful of prosecutors, and one complicated murder case would take up all their people for too long a period of time. So we do have a criminal division, but we only get authority essentially when a county prosecutor asks us to take on a case.
Okay. Let's see, the next question that we have Can you speak to the state's involvement, if any, in the case against 4 Pierce County officers charged with the murder of Manuel Ellis?
Yeah, I won't be able to say much about this because this is an active case, but yes, that is an example of a case that the AG's office does have. And that's a good example where sort of the local law enforcement that would typically, the Pierce County Prosecuting Attorney's Office, they'd be the ones who would typically bring a case in Pierce County, but they felt there was a conflict there, right? That there were local officers alleged to have acted improperly in the death of Manuel Ellis. Therefore, right, we were brought in. I can also say, by the way, the governor can also ask me to take a case as well. But that is a case that we do have. I can say what's out there publicly about this, but no more. I hope you understand. And so that was a decision of mine, obviously working with my team on whether or not to charge officers in the death of Manuel Ellis. We did charge officers, multiple officers in the death of Manuel Ellis. It's been sort of well documented in the media, so I encourage you to read about that. I hope you understand that the case is in the early stages. I can't go beyond that. But yes, that was actually a case that we handled because local law enforcement could not, because there are obvious conflicts that were inherent in who was alleged to have committed the criminal offense. And so that's why my office was given jurisdiction to handle it.
Okay, so the next question we have, could you tell us how many open unsolved cases of missing and Indigenous women there are currently? And
No, yeah.
Oh, no, not at all.
I mean that's part of the challenge, right? Is the data, right? I mean, there's sort of a certain number that is well below what is actually the case, right? I don't know what that precise number is, but just to be clear, whatever that number is, it is everybody understands is a small percentage of what is actually going on, right? Nobody really disputes that. And so that is part of the challenge of how local law enforcement agencies even classify an individual, right? Whether by ethnicity or not, whether because they're Native or not. There's just huge challenges, which I hopefully I mentioned in my introductory comments. If I didn't, I should have, is that just getting our arms around the data, the scope of the crisis is truly a big part of our challenge. And so I don't want to get out ahead of the task force. It's their job to make recommendations, but I know, having been a part of a lot of conversations with tribal members and tribal leaders and others, is that one thing I think that some folks are thinking about and hoping to see is better, that's putting it mildly, better consistency in how these types of cases are documented, how they're tracked, how the information is shared across lines of law enforcement, because that there is not, as you imagine, we have literally hundreds of law enforcement agencies from very, very small towns to big, complex entities like King County, for example, right? And you've got everything in between. And I can assure you that no two systems are exactly the same, as you might imagine. They're very, very different across the state. And so getting some consistency around how we document these cases will be important. And number two, I would say identifying those cases that jurisdictions may have, even if they haven't classified it as missing or murdered Indigenous women and people, right? That's also part of it. So there have been some attempts to try to document in certain jurisdictions, but truly the scale of the crisis, I think is fair to say, would be woefully underreported at this stage.
All right, one more question on this topic, and then I'm going to shift gears to our other one for a bit. Sure. It sounds like our neighbors in Canada have been, and this is something I learned from reading this question, working on a similar task force. Has there been any effort in connecting with them on that?
Yeah, so there is a lot. I mean, one positive that's coming out right now with, even just with Washington creating this task force, I know that there's been a lot that's generated any number of conversations, national media to other law enforcement agencies. So yes, we want to learn from those who have been trying to address this issue as well. So there are those sort of cross-pollinations of conversations going on for sure, which is a good thing. And hopefully we can learn from others in terms of how they're trying to address this. And hey, maybe others will be able to learn from us in our task force. Certainly there's been I've had multiple national media interviews along with Annie Forsman, who's our coordinator on this issue, because there is interest nationally in this issue. And typically those national media folks say, well, this task force is unusual, right? They're not seeing other states doing that. So there's not been a lot of that going on, but those that are taking similar steps, yes, we will be or are in conversation with already.
Awesome. Okay, shifting back to some of our opioid questions from earlier. Can you explain any connection between drug traffickers in LA and the opioid case that you guys are pursuing here?
Well, I mean, I guess a couple of thoughts. I mean, it's part of our testimony that we've already presented at our trial came from an individual in sort of the northwest part of Washington State, and she's someone who's like kind of on the ground, trying to help folks dealing with addiction and overdoses. And in that testimony, one thing that's become clear is for so many folks who suffer, for example, from heroin addiction, they start with opioids, right? And then move to heroin. And that is extremely common. And so, when it comes to whether it's the dealing of heroin, for example, right? Often that is fueling an addiction that began with an addiction to opioids. And that addiction to opioids, and people move on to other drugs, including heroin. So, those connections are there. For us in terms of a legal case, we have to show is that these distributors, again, Cardinal Health, right, AmerisourceBergen, that these distributors violated specific laws. So, for example, a key part of our case is our Consumer Protection Act in Washington State. That says that one cannot engage in unfair or deceptive business practice, for example. And so what we have to do is say, hey, they knew that these or had reason to believe that many of these orders were suspicious. They had a legal obligation to take certain steps when they saw those suspicious orders. They chose to ignore it. They did not have a system in place to track these orders and to take the right steps when they realized some were suspicious. And so that's sort of the focus in our case is on sort of their legal obligations and what they did or did not do in meeting those legal obligations.
Similar track, actually. This next question is about the responsibility of physicians in all of this. It seems like there's been a lot of focus on distributors and producers and very little on physicians. What kind of responsibility would you say that they have in this?
I'm not sure I'd say that there's little. I mean, I'd say that, in fact, sort of the defense that I've seen so far from the distributors is, hey, look at all these other bad actors out there. Okay, look at all these other bad actors out there. I don't think that defense is going to get them very far, right? The fact that there may be other bad actors out there, and look, the fact that I have a lawsuit against Purdue, right, manufacturer, against multiple distributors, right? The state takes action against pharmacies. I mean, you name it, right? There's plenty of blame to go around. We don't dispute that, right? The problem does not have sort of one entity that is causing 100% of the harm. We don't contend that, but we do contend that in this one case that we have against these three distributors, which does get an outsized amount of press for obvious reasons. These are Fortune 15 companies, right? Who shipped millions of pills into our state and ignored the law in pursuit of profits. There's no way to sugarcoat it. Okay, that is what they did. And so, look, I appreciate that there is more than those distributors to blame. That's why we have other lawsuits going on. But did they play an outsized role in fueling the epidemic? Yes, we believe that they did. And that is the heart of our case. They, part of what their case was blaming the state of Washington for certain actions we did or did not do as the state of Washington. In an important motion that was argued before the trial, often as you lead up to trial, we're before a judge. A judge will decide this case, by the way. His name is Michael Scott. He's a judge here. And so you often are sort of framing the trial, narrowing the defenses or even the claims, right? Both sides are trying to narrow those with different motions to limit what evidence can come in or expand on it. And the judge has already ruled, for example, no distributors, you can't go blaming the state, right? Well, what's at stake here is your conduct, what you did or failed to do in violation of the law, right? That's what's at issue here. But the distributor's defense is essentially pointing, if you actually go back and just listen to their opening statement, it's heavy on other actors but I don't think that defense will work for them.
All right, let's see. We've got a few new ones coming in. How can we advocate with our legislators to work on streamlining law enforcement data systems across the state? This is a little bit off topic, but I thought it was an interesting one.
Law enforcement data systems. That's a good question. I mean, there's sort of, it's a good question. I'll try and give a thoughtful answer in a limited amount of time. So what I would say is to simply raise that issue with your legislators would be important, right? And so I simply just writing to them and saying, hey, I understand there are challenges with this, please work on this issue, I think would be a first step. I mean, to give you a sense, I mean, part of it is sometimes there has to be, sort of depends on maybe the issue you're focused on, but as an example, there's a question earlier about the Manuel Ellis case, right? Officer involved, use of force that led to a death, okay? One thing that became clear to me and during that case is there is no, across our state and all these different law enforcement agencies, there is, of course, frequently officer involved use of deadly force, right? Whether it's in Pullman or Seattle or anywhere else across the state. Well, guess what? There is no place any one of you can go if you want to know, for example, how often has use of deadly force been used by law enforcement in Pullman or in a particular county or in our state. It's not public information. It's not centralized anywhere. It doesn't exist. And so I asked the legislature, we wrote a bill, my office, we took it to the legislature in last session saying, hey, every law enforcement agency in the state should be required to provide baseline information anytime there's the use of deadly force by law enforcement. Okay, what were the circumstances? Who were the officers involved? What was the ethnicity of the individual involved? You get the idea. What type of force was used? And that information needs to be made public in a central repository so many of you can go check it out for your local jurisdiction, or if you want to check it out statewide, or for the media to do it. So it's just sort of like one example, right? It's one example where that lack of information, whether it's with missing and murdered Indigenous women, or whether it's his use of deadly force by law enforcement, where it's hard to solve a problem if you don't know the scale of the problem, right? So it's hard to address it. And so whoever's asking the question, if there's a particular issue that you care about, maybe it's surrounding a certain issue in which you could ask it that way as well to your legislator, in the same way that we just addressed it with use of deadly force. But it's a big challenge, and I'm not trying to blame anybody for it, right? Just you've got different jurisdictions, and some have more resources, some have less, and they've got their own systems, and that's kind of how the world works. But we need to move to a system of being able to share information more easily and more readily to help solve some of the challenges that we have.
Awesome. Okay, this is a good one and maybe a bit of a tough one. If tribes are sovereign nations, which they are, as you said, why does the county or state have jurisdiction in their lands?
So we don't have, it's not, I mean, a couple of thoughts. So, right, tribes are sovereign nations, right? They have their own governments. But keep in mind, many tribal members don't live on a particular reservation, right? They're going to school at the University of Washington or Washington State University, right? They're living their lives. They're working somewhere in our state, or they're from another state and travel to Washington, or they're a Washingtonian who's living somewhere else, right? So yes, they're sovereign nations, but folks are traveling across our reservations and counties and cities all the time. And so by definition, if someone is missing, often they're missing off reservation, which guess what is now the jurisdiction of a county or a city or someone else. And so that's what makes it so challenging, right? You've got multiple jurisdictions in an issue that transcends governments and borders. And so no, tribes have their own governments, right? But these issues sort of transcend those borders because for the reasons that I mentioned.
Right. I mean, I think that's a really good way of putting it. If somebody's missing, you don't know where they're missing.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, so it's 7:34. I'm going to squeeze in that one last question.
Great.
And I'm stitching a couple of related ones together, but you talked a little bit about the New York judge and his involvement with the Sacklers. Also, it sounds a little bit like an abuse of some bankruptcy laws. And so people are asking about if you have examples of like maybe cases where similar things have happened or really more legitimate uses of bankruptcy laws. Like, how does this play out on a bigger stage?
Hey, it is an abuse of the bankruptcy process. I won't sugarcoat it. It is. Guess what? If you're Purdue Pharmaceutical and the Sackler family and you've got billions of dollars, guess what you can do? You can hire the best lawyers money can possibly buy. And guess what? You can buy a lot of lawyers with that. And I'll tell you what those lawyers did. They looked around, they said, well, here's what we want to do. Purdue's going to file for bankruptcy, and we want the Sacklers to get a legal shield for life. But there's a problem. They're not bankrupt. They're billionaires. They've acknowledged, by the way, I'll come back to the question. They acknowledged when we questioned them at the bankruptcy hearing, the Sackler family, they had to investments, that they'll be wealthier when they're done making these payments than they are today. Okay, they're one of the wealthiest families in the country. So what their lawyers did was they said, well, we've got to find a way to get them a legal shield for life. So no one's taking them to court, like me. Okay. And so what they did was they looked around, because many bankruptcy judges will not agree to that type of bankruptcy. In other words, if you're not going through bankruptcy, they don't let you come in, right? They don't let you, they do not let you graft on to a bankruptcy, throw some money into it and get a legal shield. Many bankruptcy judges will not do that. They don't think that's proper. But there's a federal bankruptcy judge in White Plains, New York. He's the only one there. And guess what Purdue Pharma School did? They incorporated there a few months before filing bankruptcy, knowing the one bankruptcy judge in White Plains, New York is well known for approving these types of deals. That's how it works, okay? So they chose their judge because they knew what that judge would do. Approve a bankruptcy that allows the Sackler family, who's not going through bankruptcy, right, to get a legal shield for life. And guess what? That's exactly what he did. So this case may well end up at the US Supreme Court. In fact, I'm guessing that it will, although you never know about these things, but in part because there is a dispute on whether or not a bankruptcy judge should even have that power. And the reason why I'm optimistic that if and when this case gets to the Supreme Court, that we might prevail is because if you think about the Supreme Court, in fact, there's been arguments at the Supreme Court just this week that have been in the news quite a bit, right? And a lot of the discussion from some of the more conservative justices, right, is states' rights. States should be able to choose what they want to do. It's all about states' power. The power of the state, okay, is sort of central to those conservative justices. Well, guess what? How can one bankruptcy judge in White Plains, New York, tell a state like Washington and the top law enforcement official in Washington, say, guess what? You can't take that family to court because I, bankruptcy judge in White Plains, New York, just gave him a legal shield for life, even though they're not going through bankruptcy. I'm willing to bet that conservative justices, if they're being true to their orientation that states have power and states' rights is that important, well, hey, what's some bankruptcy judge, unelected bankruptcy judge doing, limiting my ability to prosecute a case on your behalf, right? Combine that with other justices who I do not think on the court, more liberal justices who will look too kindly on the Sackler family getting a legal shield for life for all sorts of reasons, right? And so it's why I actually think we have a pretty good legal argument. Look, there's arguments on the other side, but in sort of leading this appeal, at the end of the day, it's kind of what I mentioned earlier, is that it just seems fundamentally unfair to me. It is an abuse of the bankruptcy process. It's only because they've got so much money that they can get away with this or think they can get away with it. And I respect my many colleagues who agreed to the settlement, agreed to this deal. To them, they're saying we're getting money and that money can be used to help people suffering from addiction. And that is true. That is true. But at what cost, right? If the Sacklers can get away with this, guess what? In a couple of years, some other wealthy individual or wealthy family will do the exact same thing. They'll go into White Plains and get the exact same thing. And I guess just at the most basic level as a lawyer, it just offends my sense of justice. that they can do that. It just does. And sometimes you can get a really complicated case and you can make it really complicated and spend a lot of time thinking about it. On the other hand, sometimes complicated cases are just really kind of simple, honestly, right? They're just kind of simple. And in this case, in a way, it's kind of simple. It's not right. It's not okay. How do I explain to my 13-year-old kids that that's the way it works? You don't get that kind of justice. You don't. I don't get it. We don't. And so I just don't believe in multiple forms of justice in our justice system. I just disagree with that fundamentally. And so, look, I've got some of my colleagues who are mad at me for appealing it, right? And I understand that. And some who are good friends of mine, but I just feel like I have to take the path that I think is right for the people of this state. And so I won't be surprised, whatever this trial court judge decides, and we felt the hearing went very well for us, by the way, whatever that judge decides, expect to get appealed at the Court of Appeals. That's where you get a 3-judge panel, and then appeal from there on up to the U.S. Supreme Court. And I won't shock me if sometime in what year are we in 2022, if we're up at the Supreme Court in 2022 on this case. So, hey, Helen, thanks so much for all the questions and for all the questions all of you asked. I'm sorry I've got to break away tonight, but I think I mentioned as we were getting started here that my 13-year-old daughter has a softball practice indoors, thankfully, but she's got a softball practice over at Magnuson Park. And so I'm a single dad today. As I mentioned earlier, my wife's out of town, so I've got to get my daughter over to softball practice. But I so appreciate all the questions and the legal and voters and the Foley Institute. Tom Foley, by the way, a former assistant attorney general in the AG's office in Washington State. And just really appreciate all the questions. I hope you're staying healthy. Go Cougs, and we'll see you all again sometime soon. Thanks so much, Helen. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much for being here.
Have a great night, everybody.